Ramiro Monroy is a Mexican mining entrepreneur and investor based in Hong Kong. He's the founder and managing director of Emerging Markets Capital, an investment firm based in Hong Kong, investing primarily in mining exploration equities. Jorge holds a bachelor's degree from the State University of New York and an MBA in finance from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He is fluent in Spanish, English, Hindi, and he speaks conversational Chinese. The topic of his speech is the effect of Mexican immigration into the USA. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jorge Ramiro Monroy.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you, Jayant, for inviting me to come here. I've attended the seminar for a number of years now, and I've always really appreciated Jayant. I get to see him speaking around the world, as we often attend the same conferences, but I also follow everything that he writes about, and he's really exposed me to a lot of fantastic ideas and a lot of, a very interesting way to look at the world. And about a year ago, I hosted Jayant in Hong Kong, and we did a small version of this seminar, Capitalism and Morality. And it was a fantastic experience to do it in Hong Kong. And something really interesting happened. He asked me to speak. Actually, I don't know if you asked me or maybe I volunteer to speak about basically the same topic I'm going to speak about today. And I had entitled my talk on that day, "The Balkanization of Mexico, NAFTA, and something like the decline of Western civilization." And when the publicity came for the event, I received a call from the Mexican consulate in Hong Kong. And the person on the phone was saying, you better not say anything bad about Mexico. It was a few months after I think 2-3 months after Trump had come into power. And I said, look, he's like, what are you going to talk about? And I said, look, respectfully, I'm going to talk about whatever I'm going to talk about, and that's about as much as I'm going to tell you. But then a few hours before we were going to start the seminar, the president of the Mexican Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong, and if you can believe there is such a thing, came to the venue and said, we're going to heckle you, and we're going to don't say anything negative. So, I just wanted to share that because that is the world we live in now. Our society has become so brittle. You can't say anything anymore. Political correctness is really just going to such an extreme. And I was thinking about the fact that 2 years ago when or maybe not even 2 years ago, I think a year and a half ago, when we did the seminar in Hong Kong, it would have been totally fine for a speaker to get up and speak freely and potentially critically about the Chinese government. And if you have been following what's happening in the news in Hong Kong over the past 2 weeks, I don't think you could do that anymore. Especially somebody like me who's an expat, you would potentially in a situation where you say something critical and then you get to the airport and they say, you can't come in anymore. So that is actually, when we worry about politically correctness in the West and how that is affecting us, but what's happening in China, it's in a different scale. It's in an unprecedented scale. What's happening in Hong Kong right now, it's almost hard to believe. When I was just watching the protest early this morning, and I wanted to, with the minutes that Jayant has kindly given me, I wanted to talk about Mexican immigration, but in the context of what's happening geopolitically. And one thing that's very interesting is that you look in my opinion, there's two colliding forces coming together. In the one hand, you have the U.S., which up until now has been the motor of the global economy. The U.S. is the global currency for trade. And then in the other hand, you have China. And then when you talk about capitalism and morality, China is just such an interesting economy and system to think about, because in the one hand, they have some of the worst practices of predatory capitalism, growth at no cost with no accountability. And then in the other hand, it's a totalitarian regime that's in the business of controlling people. But in the other hand, when you're talking about morality, capitalism and morality, what the Chinese have done over the past 20 to 30 years is truly miraculous. You've taken about 500 million people who were peasants, and in one generation, those people, the offspring of those people, the children and grandchildren own apartments in Shanghai that cost $2 million. And I get to interact with those kids on a daily basis. I'm based in Hong Kong. And you have to applaud them for that. I took a flight from Toronto to New York on LaGuardia. And let me tell you, you'd be hard pressed to find an airport that's in such decay in China. You go to a city that you've never heard of before in China, small city of 6 million people. And they have an amazing airport, amazing trains. And it's a population that's very determined, and they're in the rise. China is, of course, having a lot of problems at the moment, domestically, internationally. This trade war situation is affecting them seriously. But at the end of the day, it's a country it's on the rise. And then in the opposite spectrum, the U.S. is doing everything in its power to diminish its global influence. And this is where I wanted to talk a little bit about how immigration into Mexico and the part it plays in this in this puzzle, so to speak. So if I told you a little bit about the talk I gave in the previous seminar in Hong Kong, and I had entitled it The Balkanization of Mexico. And Balkanization is a geopolitical term that means the process of splitting a country or a region into different areas with by political means, and obviously referring to its namesake, what happened in the Balkans in the 90s. And in Mexico, if you look historically, if you looked at a map of Mexico in 1848, you would have seen that we owned California, we owned Arizona, Nevada, and a few years earlier, Texas had become an independent nation with the support of the U.S. government. And a lot of Americans don't. I'm surprised by how a lot of Americans don't know this, but the U.S. actually took over the entire Mexico, the entire country. The U.S. flag flew from Mexico City for about a year, or a year or two. And Washington at the time didn't think they could govern such a big territory, so they did a settlement with the U.S. where they took the states that I mentioned before, and of course those states came with a population of Mexicans. And then if you fast forward to the next sort of big movement of migrations for Mexicans into the U.S., that happened with NAFTA in 1993. So, and NAFTA has been tremendously positive for Mexico by and large, but there was one particular effect in the way that NAFTA wasn't negotiated, which was the U.S. and Mexico were both allowed to subsidize the farming industry. And Mexico knew that this would be put in them at a disadvantage because of the level of subsidies that the U.S. can provide. But at the same time, they felt, in any deal negotiation, you have to, you have to give something, and they felt that they could take, especially the lower end of manufacturing. So what this provoked was between 1993 and 1997, if you look at a chart, about 8 million Mexicans, mostly farmers, lost their jobs. The Mexican agricultural system collapsed completely, and nowadays Mexico imports the majority of its food from the U.S., including corn, which is the staple crop of the Aztecs. We have to import it it's cheaper to buy from the U.S. And this is because we have we have about 10 million Mexicans who, most of them migrated between 94 and 2005, and who had no farming jobs anymore. So they now are the farmers in the U.S. who are there illegally, and and that's made. If you look at the charts of the growth of the U.S. agricultural sector over that period, it's quite tremendous. On the other hand, Mexico became a significant power in car manufacturing, which I don't think the U.S. had expected, obviously because of our lower cost of production, and that had a tremendous effect in what's happened in Detroit, and which all of you are very familiar with, and that, in a nutshell, is what has provoked Trump to raise to power. And I think all of you are very aware of all the debate that's happening with Mexican immigration into the U.S. But with the time that I have, I wanted to just offer some thoughts, with the context that I have given you. And I think if you look at the way that both Republicans and Democrats speak about Mexican immigration, and in general, U.S. society, you get the sense that, in the one camp, people think, oh, these poor people, let's let them in. They need to be here because, they're hopeless. In the other hand, you have the Republicans who want to stop that immigration. But if you tune out CNN, Fox News, and the mainstream sources of information, and you just take a look at the situation, with an objective point of view. The reality is, if the U.S. wanted to, you could take those farmers, they know where they are, go and take them and send them back to Mexico and see what's going to happen to the U.S. economy. It would collapse the farming industry pretty quickly. So that's the reality. The reality is neither, Trump doesn't want to, he might want to stop immigration. That might be true. But he sure as hell doesn't want to get rid of those farmers because, it would be a tremendous damage to the economy. The reality is, in my opinion, the U.S. government and the country as a whole does not do any favors to Mexico by taking all these immigrants for a number of reasons. From the Mexican side, the government has benefited tremendously from this immigration. The combined GDP that's produced by the Mexican Americans, both illegal and legal, is actually about the same as the entire GDP of Mexico. So if you think about it from their point of view, they have a whole market in Mexico. The remittances that are sent to Mexico is at the par with oil, which is our top source of revenue, and of course, drugs, which is not classified, publicly, but that's a reality. It's about the same level: oil, drugs, remittances from the immigrants. And the reality is, the Mexican government benefits in a number of ways from having those immigrants. Number one, the rate of unemployment in Mexico is extremely low. People are underpaid, but essentially there's no unemployment. Some people have informal jobs, but the reality is the majority of the population is occupied, primarily because there's a constant outflow of labor. And then number two, the business class, the Mexican oligarchy, benefits tremendously from the remittances that are sent from the U.S. The president who negotiated NAFTA, Carlos Salinas, actually gifted during NAFTA, there was a lot of privatization of public companies and government companies. And he basically gave it to his friends at cents on the dollar with money loaned by the government. And if you know about one of the Mexican billionaires, Salinas Pliego, he owns the Western Union franchise for Mexico. So he takes a few cents out of every dollar that's sent by these immigrants to Mexico, and then the Western Unions are in this sort of hard to describe, like a supermarket type establishment that's all over Mexico. And the families of the immigrants can buy anything you can need for the home, electric appliances, TVs, on 3-year payments at 100% interest a year. So you buy a blender, instead of paying $10, you paid $30, but you pay it over 3 years, and take a little bit at a time. You can get a loan. All right, you get your check from Western Union that the farmers send back home, and immediately you give that money to them. So the reality is that these poor farmers are pawns. In the one sense, they're benefiting the U.S. economy tremendously, and in the other hand, the Mexican oligarchy and the government have a tremendous amount of benefits as well. And the problem is relatively easy to solve using common sense. Of course, it's not super easy, but the way that it's been politicized, it's been it's made it unnecessarily difficult. And in my opinion, the other chart that you need to look at that's very significant is Mexicans. We're not great inventors. We're not great athletes, but we can have a lot of children. and if you look at the chart of the projections of Mexicans in the U.S., by 2050 there's going to be about 150 Hispanics, of which roughly 70 to 80% of those are going to be Mexicans. California, Texas, by 2035 will already be majority Mexican population. These young illegal and legal Mexicans who immigrate are hardworking, family-oriented, and their counterparts, who are white, are, going through a difficult time with the opioids crisis. So think about the effects that that's going to have in the future, because, debatable as to whether it's good to have this immigration into Mexico for Mexicans in the U.S. or not. There's a lot of arguments, in favor and against. But the reality is that it's going to change the U.S. And the reality is that both the U.S. and Mexico are weakened with this lunacy that's going on. And then Canada with the craziness that you have going on here as well. If you put Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. as a block, we would be, much more powerful than China in every way. Our economy would be significantly bigger than China. It's self-sufficient in energy, self-sufficient, have the biggest market, resources. But the reality is that, this Balkanization, so to speak, is going to continue, both in the US, both in Mexico, both in Canada. And this is all going to be to the benefit of China. And so that's the big question. What happens once China becomes the dominant power? And, again, what they're doing in terms of the way their brand of capitalism, or whatever you would call it, what happens to civilization, Western civilization, after that. So thank you for your time.
One quick question, if there's any.
Oh, hello. My name is Rajiv. The question is, wouldn't it be a good idea if the Mexican government, in collaboration with the drug cartels, encouraged illegal immigration from America? A lot of white people going through the opioid crisis, like you said, etc. So why don't we reverse the flow, and maybe there'll be some positive benefits for both parties?
You mean like get Americans into Mexico?
Yeah, illegally. Legally doesn't matter.
Well, it's already taking place. There's 2 million Americans living in Mexico, mostly legally, mostly retirees. It's already in place. I mean, the reality is the opioid crisis, I don't think it has an easy solution, or perhaps no solution at all. And I honestly don't think this whole dynamics, immigration and drug trafficking, I don't think it has a happy ending, honestly. I think in our lifetime, or maybe in my lifetime, not everybody's lifetime in this room. There's going to be, sorry, respectfully. I think we'll see something very. That was the timer for the time. We'll see something very dramatic happening in this topic. It's just very difficult, and Americans are moving in large numbers, Americans and Canadians, to Mexico, because of similar to what one of the speakers was talking about with healthcare, and if you look at it conceptually, the integration of the three countries would make so much sense, but unfortunately, I think it's going to just grow more and more divisive.
Thank you, Jorge.